Today we are tackling a big topic that stirs up a lot of debate. How do Muslims today relate to human rights? Especially when international human rights law doesn't always seem to line up with Islamic law. When we look at modern Muslim thought, we can generally see two major approaches: the defensive approach and the harmonistic approach. Let's break each one down in plain terms and look at real examples of how Muslims from both camps make their case. First, the defensive approach. This camp is pretty skeptical of international human rights. They tend to see it as a Western-made system, shaped by European and American values, not something that came from within the Islamic tradition. Some of those in this camp even believe that human rights law is being used as a tool, a kind of moral measuring stick to criticize Islam or pressure Muslim societies to change. That's in part why when many Muslim majority countries sign onto global human rights treaties, like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, they add reservations. Basically, they're saying, we'll follow this treaty, but only if it doesn't conflict with Islamic law or Sharia. This isn't just about women's rights either. You'll see similar objections from Muslim states in other treaties too, whenever they feel the international standard clashes with Islamic law or Sharia. Then you have Muslim thinkers who reviewed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and basically said, if something in here doesn't match up with Sharia, Muslims simply don't need to follow it. Some scholars who adopt a defensive approach say that the whole foundation of rights in Islam is divinely revealed, while Western human rights are based on human experience. So for them, it's not just a matter of small differences, it's two totally different worldviews. Some scholars who follow this defensive approach say that Islam already had human rights well before the West even thought of them. In his view, these rights are God-given and can't be altered or ignored by any government. They're binding on everyone, Muslim or not, and violations carry real spiritual and legal consequences, unlike Western systems, which they think are mostly symbolic. Now let's talk about the harmonistic approach. And this one is very interesting. People in this camp believe that Islam and international human rights aren't enemies, they're potential allies. Sure, they admit there are tensions between the two, but they believe those can be reconciled using the tools within Islamic tradition. So how do they do that? They use several strategies. For example, they highlight Qur'anic values that already support human rights. Where possible, they reinterpret early Islamic rulings that came from specific socio-historical contexts. They also draw on Islamic legal principles, like the higher objectives of Islamic law, which prioritize justice, human dignity, and welfare. Scholars associated with this approach argue that the Qur'an and the Prophet's teachings already support rights like life, property, privacy, justice, personal freedom, religious freedom, freedom of expression, and equality. In other words, these aren't Western ideas. They're deeply rooted in Islamic values too. Let me give a couple of examples of this harmonistic approach. In relation to women's rights, there are reform-minded Muslim scholars who argue that classical Islamic law, as it developed between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, reflected the patriarchal norms of that time, not the actual spirit of the Qur'an. So when the classical rulings seem to favor men or restrict women, these scholars say, let's go back to the Qur'an itself and read it in its proper historical context. By doing that, they believe we can uncover more just and gender-equal interpretations that are faithful to the core values of Islam and consistent with modern human rights. Here's another example: the reform of family law in Morocco in 2004. Moroccan scholars and activists worked with religious leaders to reinterpret Islamic legal principles in ways that support gender equality, especially within marriage and divorce. They used tools like independent reasoning and higher objectives of Sharia to argue that protecting women's rights aligns with the objectives of Islamic law and with international human rights standards. This reform was actually endorsed by religious authorities in the country, showing that it's possible to blend faithful Islamic interpretation with human rights commitments in real-life law. So to wrap it up, the defensive approach says Islam is a complete and superior system. We don't need Western human rights frameworks, and some of them may even threaten our values. The Harmonistic Approach says there may be tension, sure, but Islam has the tools to meet modern human rights standards if we use the right interpretive methods. Both sides are coming from a place of trying to protect Islamic values, but they see the relationship with modern human rights very differently. So, what do you think? Can Islam and international human rights law coexist, or are they just too different? Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.